Dana, you know what worries me? What worries me is that about 99% of the country knows a tiny, tiny fraction of what you know about the laws. And when I hear things like red flag laws, obviously, once I'm done vomiting in the trash can, I scream about them. But I'm worried that that is appealing to the average American. It's because it sounds so benign, doesn't it? Well, this guy's going nuts. Just have mom call the cops and take away his guns. Do you think that's something that does resonate, that is more popular with Americans than it should be?
Yeah, I think there's something to that. You touched on something too. You would think that lawmakers would feel that it's their civic duty to make sure that their constituents are informed about the legal options that they have already available to them, but they don't want to do that, particularly in any event that involves the Second Amendment, because this is about limiting and restricting law-abiding people's rights. It's not about helping people who are in a time of mental turmoil or anguish to the point where they might actually pose a danger to society, because they don't do anything to that person. They remove an object. It's only about the gun. It's not about the person in the red flag instance. And so I do, because not a lot of people, shockingly, are even aware of this process or even how to go about it. I mean, I had a conversation with a pretty serious conservative, somebody who was pretty well known just a couple of weeks ago about this issue. They were entirely unaware of the legal processes that existed in their particular state of residence, where they could go and have this done already if there was someone within their family or a friend that they were concerned about. And I think that we've grown apathetic as Americans. I mean, you can only blame politicians so much, but honestly, if you're an American, you have an obligation as a free person to be aware of what your rights are and aren't. You can't outsource it to pundits like me or you. You can't outsource it to bloggers or anybody else. I mean, a lot of people need to take the responsibility of being educated about the laws that they have and the freedoms that they have in the country where they live.
Dana, I wanted to ask you about something we hear all the time when it comes to mass shootings. I mean, if there's a mass shooter of any kind, and this person did have some kind of history, a family member had complained about him, he was on the FBI's radar. Everyone knows the headlines you see that leak out days afterwards. I argue with people about this all the time, that what does that mean? Or do you want law enforcement to start showing up at these people's homes, confiscating their weapons, throwing them in custody before they've actually hurt someone? I think people react way too emotionally, understandably, in the wake of a mass shooting, and don't think about what it means if you want law enforcement empowered to enforce pre-crime.
No, that's a great word, Jesse. Pre-crime. That's really what this is, particularly since red flag is usually an ex parte process, meaning that the individual who is the subject of this proceeding isn't even aware or involved in all of the stuff leading up to it. Case in point, this was 2 years ago. There was a gentleman who was mentioned. He was the subject of a red flag order in Maryland, and cops arrived at his home. This was around 5 in the morning, still dark outside. The guy hears somebody banging on his door, and it's that early. It's still, dark outside. Right when you wake up, you don't really have your wits all about you. And he answers the door. They're there to take his firearms and serve this red flag order. And of course, he has a firearm, because whenever you hear stuff going on at night, I mean, yeah, that's how people respond. He was shot and killed during the service of a red flag order. And when you are accusing someone of a crime so serious, to strip them of their natural rights, there needs to be a penalty before you have to have a verdict and due process before there is a penalty that is served. If it is serious enough to strip someone of their natural rights, then it is serious enough not to forego due process. And in all of these instances, there was the story of the FedEx murderer in Indiana. This guy was apparently red flagged once already. How did he end up falling through the cracks? When you look at the situation, the sad story of Sandy Hook, this was an individual who absolutely should have been a prohibited possessor, but unfortunately he had an enabling parent, and he stole firearms, which was the first felony offense, before he ended up taking those firearms and murdering people. When you look at Virginia Tech, that murderer in one of the worst mass shootings that involved pistols in the nation's history, this was another individual who should have been a prohibited possessor, and he was supposed to be mediating meeting with a psychologist according to a court order, he ended up falling through the cracks. When you look at Sutherland Springs, this was when Air Force records were not transmitted because this guy was a prohibited possessor due to domestic violence. And, you know, that Lautenberg Amendment that everyone says doesn't exist, he should have been a prohibited possessor. He shouldn't have been able to go and purchase a firearm. I mean, and some of the books that I've written, whether it's Hands Off My Gun or Fly Over Nation, I've looked at so many of these awful tragedies and discussed ways that they could have been prevented. Like Jesse in Charleston, which I know you've talked about, there was no loophole that allowed that murderer in that case to obtain a firearm. In fact, that statement that was written by then FBI Director James Comey is actually still up on the FBI's website, wherein they had to admit to a paperwork error. Unfortunately, they didn't realize that there was some geographical differences in discussing what police department was responsible for arresting that particular murderer. And so that guy was able to go out and legally purchase a firearm due to paperwork error involving government bureaucrats. So you have a bunch of tragedies that have been really, I think, aided by government incompetency. And the people who should be paying the price for that, Jesse, are not law-abiding Americans.
Hey, thanks so much for watching The First on YouTube. If you liked what you saw, go ahead and like and subscribe. You heard me. Like it, subscribe. You'll get a lot more of it and a lot more of me.